It strikes me that one of the tragedies in the United States today is the lack of alternative vision. I think in many areas of governmental life, there's a certain depression in that there is an understanding that something has to happen, that something is fundamentally wrong with the society that we're living in today, but somehow or another the new ideas are not coming forward and new energies are not coming forward. What we're here tonight to talk about is a new vision, admittedly on a small scale, but those of us who work for the city of Burlington think everything starts here and goes outward. But what we're talking about here is a new vision about the relationship of people to the work that they do. Now, the fact of the matter is that many of us work 40 hours a week, or 50 hours a week, or 60 hours a week, all over the United States of America. And we've become used to the way we relate to our employers. We understand and we accept it as a basic reality that we go to work for somebody else, that somebody else decides the kind of product that will be produced, how it will be produced, where it will be produced, and when it will be produced. And that somebody else has the right to say that, gee whiz, we can't make money in this town anymore, and we're going to leave and go to the Dominican Republic where we can get workers for $2 or $3 a day. Why do we have to pay all of $4 an hour when we can get cheaper labor abroad? I, the owner, will make that decision, and you, the worker, and you, the community that used to house this company or this factory or this office complex, tough luck. It's mine. I own it. I will do as I please. And it seems to me that not only is this bad economics, but it's very bad for the fiber and the soul of the nation. Because what it does to people is it makes all of us very childlike, very infantile, very dependent on the big daddy who has the money and can call the shots. Yes, sir. No, sir. And I think what this country is hungering for is opportunities for people to feel more part of the process, to feel an ability to say, I make decisions. Little symptomatic, a little example of how this works. In the city of Burlington, as some of you may know, if you drive our streets, we have planted 2,000 trees. And I think that's great. I think it's made the city a lot more beautiful city than it was before. But you know what's most important about that project? It wasn't city government that did it. Primarily, the people who planted those trees were the people who live on those blocks. And what we've noticed is there's been an extraordinary response. People take a great deal of pride in the fact that they planted that tree. And they're going to nurture that tree, and they watch that tree against vandalism. They have put some of themselves into that process. And it seems to me that probably one of the most important changes that we can bring about in the United States of America today is give people more of an opportunity to help make the decisions that affect their lives. Frankly, democracy cannot just mean the opportunity to vote for a Walter Mondale or a Ronald Reagan once every 4 years. That's better than they have in other countries, but it's not enough. I think if we have a vision as to what democracy is about, it's got to mean the right of a working person to control his or her job, to have some say about what's being produced, to sit down with the other workers and say, this is what I think we should do. And that's the way people grow, and they learn, and they don't become atomized, and they don't become alienated dummies who are there solely to make a check at the end of the week. Well, needless to say, I don't think this revolution is going to happen overnight. But I do think it's important that in Burlington, Vermont, and in cities and towns all over this country, workers and people who are interested in true democracy begin talking about these ideas. Because I think the sentiment is out there. I think people are not happy about a society where we're seeing greater and greater concentration of power and wealth. You read it in the papers every day. This gigantic corporation has just bought out that gigantic corporation. And this interlocking directorship not only owns this company, but it owns that company. It all comes down to a pyramid. We have a handful of people with the wealth and with the power. And I think what many of us would like to see is turning that pyramid on its head and giving power back to the people. I congratulate very sincerely the organizers of this event tonight, and I think and I hope very much that maybe here in Burlington, Vermont, and I think, as I understand, we are unique in being the only city in America that is sponsoring activities like this and processes like this, that maybe in Burlington, Vermont, we will strike a little bit of a spark that might spread around the country. Thank you.
I think a question that many of us have asked is, what's really going on in the Burlington economy? I think if you look around town, you'll see that there's an incredible amount of development activity, particularly in the central business district, more than has ever occurred in this city. We've estimated that there's $300 million worth of development projects in the pipeline. If you read the statistics from the Bureau of Labor, it tells you that Burlington has one of the lowest unemployment rates in the country. Recently, it has been the second lowest unemployment rate in the country. But a closer look, and in Burlington we have taken a closer look. We have done a strategic analysis of the Burlington economy and probably have a more detailed understanding of our economy and a strategy to address the weaknesses of our economy than any other city. It's a pretty interesting document that I know that many of you are familiar with. But if you take a closer look, you come to the realization that there are concerns, there are weaknesses, and there are disparities in our economy that we can't ignore, that we can't bury. Let me just briefly address some of those. The most awesome problem in this city, in terms of a trend, is the feminization of poverty. The statistics are really distressing. We start off with a disproportionate number of female heads of household. About 20% of the families in the city of Burlington are headed by females. Those 20% of our families represent 60% of the individuals in the city that are living below the poverty level. The median family income for female-headed households is 56% of the median family income for households in general. So clearly, the most distressing characteristics of our economy is a dilemma of unemployed, underemployed women. A second problem deals with working-class youth. There are many kids in this city who don't have the opportunity or the inclination to go to college, and they're out in the streets with not much out there in terms of a promising economic future. The third problem, or the third distressed population as we would characterize it, are many of the folks that are in this audience tonight. An extremely well-educated, qualified, motivated group of individuals who really have not found your niche in the workplace yet. And many of you are working in jobs that aren't particularly satisfying and that don't offer very high levels of compensation. You're working for peanuts, you're working in dead-end jobs, and you offer an incredible pool of resources in terms of the entrepreneurs of tomorrow. Other problems are that in Burlington, as in the state of Vermont generally, wages are low. We're certainly not the poorest in the county or the state, but nevertheless, wages are low, and wages in Burlington lag behind wages in the county. We're vulnerable. If you look at the economic base of the region, and we are dealing with a regional economy, it's very much dependent upon high-tech manufacturing. IBM is obvious with 8,000 employees. IBM is the biggest private sector employer of Burlington residents. What happens at some point in the future if we lose our position as the manufacturer of the high-tech computer products? We're also vulnerable in the city. There's an incredible dependence, a high level of dependence on essentially three institutions: the Medical Center, the University of Vermont, and General Electric. So in Burlington, unlike a lot of communities, because of the health of our economy, we have the luxury to begin to address some of these problems and to look at the quality of jobs. And what we are attempting to do through the Burlington Local Ownership Project is to drive for job quality over job quantity. And our goals are simple and are essentially twofold. One, we want to achieve local control over the economy. As the mayor says, we don't want to be dependent upon the corporate decision makers sitting in New York City, We want the residents of Burlington to be the key decision makers in deciding what's good for the future of the city of Burlington. And secondly, we want to create quality employment opportunities for the residents of Burlington. And employee ownership offers this. Now, we don't look at employee ownership as the panacea. We don't look at it as the only model. But you're going to hear tonight why, in our opinion, it's the preferred model. Jobs which are owned, or businesses which are owned by employees, tend to be more stable. There is certainly less of a tendency to relocate based upon corporate decisions or based upon cheaper labor outside of the area. In employee-owned businesses, there is normally a tendency to hire local people. In employee-owned businesses, the fruits of the labor, the profits and the wages are retained by the workers. And employee-owned businesses provide for a fundamental level of fairness and equity, both in terms of sharing of the wealth as well as in terms of sharing of the power. It's not a simple task that we're about here. Essentially what we're talking about is achieving structural reform of our economy. We have to be patient. It's not going to happen overnight. What we're talking about here is establishing a new model of business ownership. But we think that it is possible. It's possible for a number of reasons. One is that with the mayor, with the city council, we have a politically supportive environment. We also have broad-based community support. I'd like to introduce some members of the Burlington Local Advisory Task Force who are here this evening. They have been involved in this project over the last year and represent a broad-based community support who is saying local ownership makes sense and we want to pursue it. We also have in Burlington and the state of Vermont generally a strong Vermont tradition of independence. Local control has always been held as a high ideal for the people of the state of Vermont. And over the past year, we'd like to think that we have a growing awareness and acceptance of employee ownership as an alternative model to the traditional business. So I'm glad you're all here tonight. Hopefully we'll all walk away from this evening understanding a little bit better what employee ownership is about. I think you'll find it to be an interesting discussion. Just briefly, the agenda, the discussion tonight from this point forward should take no more than an hour. We're going to have a couple of different panels. We're going to have a presentation by Chris Mackin next. He's the Policy Director of the Industrial Cooperative Association, which is the largest provider of technical assistance in this country to employee-owned businesses. They've been working with the City of Burlington now for about 18 months. Then I'm going to introduce some folks, some Burlington businessmen who are interested in employee ownership. Then we're going to make aware to you what various resources, financial and technical, which you might call on to help you explore the possibilities of employee ownership. We're then going to take a brief break, and after the break, there'll be a presentation of a film on by far the most successful and largest employee-owned cooperatives in the country, based in Mondragon, Spain, who employ about 20,000 people. It's incredible. I urge you all to stay and watch this film. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to ask Chris Mackin to offer some background on employee ownership, speak a little bit to the record around the country, and tell you a little bit more about what we're attempting to do in Burlington.
Thank you, Peter. Glad to be here tonight. This great turnout. I want to tell you that we're going to have some local video. We don't have to go so far as Spain. In fact, we're going down to Pine Street a little bit and learn about a software company that's represented here tonight by Don Schramm, Data Systems Inc., that has decided to move in the direction of employee ownership. And we also have some footage of some other American companies that have moved in this direction. Let me start by explaining who I am and what the organization is that I work for. My name is Chris Mackin. I work for the Industrial Cooperative Association, which, as Peter said, is the largest full-service technical assistance organization to employee-owned companies in the country. The ICA also has a companion corporation of the ICA Revolving Loan Fund that provides equity capital to workers and managers who want to start companies of this sort or who want to buy their companies. The ICA has a staff of 15 people providing financial, legal, and educational assistance to groups of workers and managers that want to start firms. Pleased to have in the audience with me tonight two of my colleagues, Nancy Wilson, who's a business analyst, an MBA, who has been working for the last 6 months with us on this project up here in Burlington, and Steve Dawson, the director of ICA. We'll be hearing from them later. I think I should start here very quickly by some definitions to try to explain what do we mean by employee ownership. What is this phenomenon in the first place? The first thing to probably emphasize is that there are over 5,000 companies across the country that are experimenting with employee ownership now, estimated to represent between 2 and 3% of the American workforce. In other words, this is not a brand new phenomenon. It's being tried in several places. However, while that figure might be impressive, it's important to understand that there are some distinctions between different types of employee-owned companies, which I think is important to understand. And the ICA's work, and I believe what the city is most interested in, relates to one end of that spectrum. So let me show you a very simple graphic of what that spectrum is and why it's significant. Yes, sir. Put it up front. You see it there? No? Okay. Get on the other side of it. This spectrum, relatively simple. We're talking about how much employee ownership exists in any particular company that is trying this idea. Can people up there see this at all? Okay. No, you can't. I'm sorry. The important distinction here, very simple spectrum. We've got from 0% employee ownership, all stock owned by outside interests, to full 100% democratic employee ownership. In the middle of the spectrum, 50% employee ownership. The most important thing I'm wanting to emphasize is that on this side, on the 0 to 50 percentage line, we have a different phenomenon than what we have on the 50 to 100% side of the line. On this side of the line, what are referred to often as profit-sharing plans or partial employee stock ownership plans are the most familiar mechanism. Those are good forms of sharing ownership and sharing some control of employees. I don't mean to be thoroughly critical of them, but what I want to emphasize is that there's a great deal of difference in terms of the performance of the employees, in terms of the understanding of this concept, if one is on this side, on the small side of 50%, versus on the right side. We have found in our work that companies that are sharing ownership to a minority degree, to a significant minority degree, you don't get the general psychological change and an attitude on the part of employees that they're working for themselves, that they own the company. What they see is that the ownership is still in the hands of a few principals who are the chief beneficiaries, the people who control the future of the corporation. And what the ownership is looked to in those cases is as a benefit, as a sort of a passive benefit. There is not necessarily a feeling on the part of employees there that they should take a whole lot more responsibility, because at the bottom line is they know that most of the ownership and most of the control goes elsewhere. On this side of that spectrum, however, the results are much more dramatic. And I want to cite from something I didn't bring up to the spectrum, up to the lectern here, a study which speaks of this. When we're on this side of the spectrum, when we're between 50 and 100% ownership, there is a psychological change of heart, if you will, on the part of employees that we're now working for ourselves. We not only are the chief beneficiaries of what's going to happen with this corporation, we now are responsible for what's going to happen with this corporation. And it's not someone else's responsibility. Now, statistically, most of the experience with employee ownership, it should be emphasized, is on this side, is on the partial side. And there have been some interesting results. The most dramatic results, however, are on this side of the spectrum. I think that's important to emphasize. How does employee ownership work? More practical question. What does it look like inside of an employee-owned company? How does it function? One more graphic. In some senses, it's very much like what you're familiar with. In other senses, it's different. Basic organizational structure, legal structure of a democratically structured employee-owned firm. The membership, by which we mean blue and white-collar workers alike, workers in management, on a one-person, one-vote basis, one person, one vote, one share usually, elects the governing board of directors of the firm, the supreme body of the firm. That board of directors in turn appoints general management, people with day-to-day responsibility for making management decisions. General management, as in conventional companies, appoints their supervisors as necessary. Research shows that in employee-owned firms, there's generally less of a need for this level of supervision because people are motivated that they're working for themselves. They don't have to be watched. They don't have to be policed as much. They feel that the company's interest is their interest. But nevertheless, in many cases, for logistical or practical reasons, you have first-line supervision. Then, of course, you've got production work going down at the bottom of the organizational hierarchy. Now, what's the difference here? If we just look from here down, it looks pretty much like a regular company. But these worker owners and the management together constitute the only stockholders in these corporations who elect the governing board of directors and who are the only beneficiaries of its performance. And beneficiaries of its performance and also the people who have to take responsibility for its losses. So, the point I'm trying to make here is that in some important ways it looks similar. In some important ways it's very different in terms of who controls things and whose interests these companies run. Now, in terms of how decisions are handled on a day-to-day, month-to-month basis, that's going to vary from company to company. We work with companies as small as 10 workers, as big as 300 workers. And in certain of these smaller companies, people are more interested in a more participatory, consensus kind of decision-making style. That can work if structured carefully. It doesn't work when you get much bigger. You clearly have to delegate authority. Workers in big companies understand that. Workers don't want to do the general manager's job. They don't know how to do it. And it's in their interest for the general manager to do a good job, to go out and get the sales or whatever it is he's doing, and to stay out of his way. That's a common misperception of some of these firms is, will it mean if workers are owners that they're going to get in management's hair all the time? I won't tell you that there aren't any conflicts and that there aren't discussions, but the issue is how do you structure that stuff? How do you do education with workers so that they understand what the facts are, what's going on with the company, so that they understand what they know and what they don't know, and so that they can make informed decisions about electing that board of directors? And how do you make it clear what sort of delegation or division of responsibility there should be? And I think it's important to emphasize that while there is still this division of labor, this division of responsibility, there isn't as much resentment about that. That's really what I just said a minute ago. I mean, people know that they've all got a job to do. And they've got different experience, different skills, different expertise. And so they're more than glad for that general manager to have lots of authority to do what he wants. That general manager, on the other hand, it's in his interest to make sure that his employees are informed about what's going on, that there aren't just rumors shooting around the plant, and that people are informed when they exercise their all-important rights to elect the governing board of directors. Structurally, how employee ownership comes to be, and I won't dwell on the details here, be glad to go into some of this stuff in questions and answers. There are two basic forms. The first form is called an industrial cooperative. Worker cooperative comes under different terms, but that is generally the most direct form of ownership that operates pretty clearly along these lines, where the amount of shares issued is restricted. There are buyback provisions on the shares. It's direct ownership, one person, one share, one vote. We have some models that we're going to show you on TV about that. And as Peter mentioned, the Spanish experience is the most dramatic and successful example with the cooperative ownership structure, direct democratic ownership and control. More familiar in this country, more often associated with that less than 50% are employee stock ownership plan companies, ESOP companies. ESOPs, however, can be restructured, can be made democratic. There are certain tax advantages that go along with ESOPs that are significant that we use when we're representing workers and managers around the country. Those are the two basic forms. You may have heard of those through the press. I think it's important just to footnote them. Who is doing employee ownership? Where is this happening? Just some brief examples. People's Express that flies in here periodically, I understand. Seymour Specialty Wire, a 200-worker specialty wire company outside of New Haven, Connecticut, organized by the United Auto Workers. The largest, most democratic employee-owned plant closing rescue in the country. In New York City, New York Healthcare Association, a smaller company, a home healthcare company of nurses and workers who go out into the community to help older people deal with their health problems in New York City. Also associated with the labor union in that case, the Service Employees Union. Labor unions are looking at this as an idea, beginning to look at this as an idea as an organizing strategy to help them recruit new members. The ICA is under contract to the International Association of Bricklayers, interested in possibly starting new construction companies for their members, so their members can be owners. That happens to be a tradition that goes back to the very earliest days of the American labor movement. How employee-owned companies get started, those are some examples you may have heard of. It's basically three ways. Through either entrepreneurial startups, where groups of workers and managers get together, have an idea, think they don't want to organize themselves conventionally. They've gotten a start. I think Don Schramm's example is probably one of these. And they want to structure their company differently. They see the advantages of going in this direction, and they decide from the start. The second way, very important, there may be some of you out in the audience here, and there are clear tax advantages to going in this direction too, is what are called retiring owner conversions, where you have the owner of a privately held company, a closely held company, that may have no children to pass the business off to when they reach retirement age, who would be very interested, if they were informed about how it happens, and whose employees would be very interested, to sell that business to their employees, as opposed to selling to some outside interest. After all, it was the employees who made it possible for that person probably to become wealthy and successful. In many cases, those management people are very interested in the idea of selling to their employees, and the ICA and the city would be glad to try to help something like that happen. The third way, the most dramatic way that people read about in the newspapers all the time, are rescues, are plant closing rescues, buyouts. Vermont Asbestos was one a number of years back. We can get into the details of what happened in that situation during questions and answers if people want. Weirton Steel down in West Virginia that you'll see on the TV set is another one, and Seymour Specialty Wire in Connecticut that I mentioned is a third. A total, again, of over 5,000 companies that are experimenting with this, most of those, however, being in the partial realm. With a smaller number, we estimate to be somewhere between 200 and 300 that are experimenting with a more fully democratic form. What's the record of these sorts of companies? How are they doing? It's generally good. It would be disingenuous for me to tell you that every one of these things has worked. Obviously it hasn't, particularly in those situations where workers and managers have tried to take over companies that are about to close. Those companies are often companies that have been in trouble. And it's just because it's worker-owned doesn't mean they're going to be able to dig themselves out of a hole that may have been left for them. Some have been tried and failed in that arena particularly. But generally speaking, and I would say that it's really hard to cite hard research evidence because in some senses this is a new idea still, the experience has been good. The University of Michigan in 1979 did a study comparing significantly employee-owned companies with comparable companies in those markets and found employee-owned companies to be 1.5% more profitable than conventionally owned companies. Now I need the Harvard Business Review piece that you were reading. A Harvard Business Review study with the ambiguous title called The Uneven Record of Employee Ownership by Professor James O'Toole of the University of South Carolina says this about employee ownership in summing up his article. In sum, the effects on employee morale, motivation, and productivity appear most positive when ownership is direct, that is, not through a typically designed ESOP trust, when ownership is widespread, that is, almost all workers are shareholders, not just managers or those workers who are sophisticated enough to take the initiative to invest, and third, when employee ownership is broadly held, that is, when all workers have significant and not just nominal equity. He sums up by saying the ownership principle can thus be stated. The more worker ownership in a company, the better. Now, my last very quick remarks. What about the politics of this? What do we mean by progressive entrepreneurship, that daring and vague term that may have brought you here tonight? Obviously, the issue the issue at hand here is the relationship of business enterprise to the public interest generally. I think it's pretty clear that the City of Burlington and certainly the ICA recognizes the important role that every kind of business plays in an economy. One cannot be so romantic as to say this is the only way to go. There may be some positive features about this. We obviously think there are, and we want to educate people about them, but it's not the only way to go. And you're lucky to have IBM. You're lucky to have GE and other major employers who provide good quality jobs. That doesn't mean, however, that you shouldn't look at what to be doing in the future and what you could be doing better. The mayor and Peter spoke about the benefits of local ownership. Chances are you're going to trust your locally owned lumberyard or cable TV system, which I guess you've got as of today. You're going to trust those companies more than companies owned and controlled by distant interests. Decisions are made locally, profits are reinvested locally, more people are likely to be hired locally. But more specifically, what about businesses themselves? What makes a business progressive or non-progressive? Well, it would appear that there are two parts. There's a two-part answer to that question, and we can only scratch the surface here tonight. The first part is its behavior. How does a company behave relative to a community? How do they treat the community, the environment? How do they treat their employees? Important question to ask. A second question to ask, however, in terms of how progressive it is questions about its structure, about the rules that formally govern how that enterprise works, how it relates to the community, and particularly how it relates to its employees who dedicate a good part of their lives to it. If you could take away one thing from tonight's presentation, I would hope it would be a newer understanding of the importance of thinking about structure, thinking about these alternative structures when considering going into business. Unfortunately, innovative ideas like these about how businesses can be structured differently, more democratically, are not taught in our schools, are just beginning to get into some of our universities, but are generally not. The result of that, because of that, those of us who consider going into business, we uncritically inherit ideas about how businesses have to be structured from what went on before, and there's no thinking about how it could be done differently. Hopefully tonight, this will give one an idea about how it could be done differently. Finally, and this is a word to those progressives responsible for electing Bernie Sanders and the unusual people that get written about down in Boston, where I'm from all the time. They write articles about you people periodically. There's no reason, I would argue, to those particularly younger people, professional people, who are supportive of the politics of this administration, to limit yourselves to the very important vocations of government, of universities, and the nonprofit sector. There aren't a whole lot of jobs in those sectors to begin with. What I would ask you to begin to think of is to do as Ronald Reagan said on national TV a couple of weeks back in his message on tax reform. He looked into the TV screen and said, think about it, young people. Go out there and start a business. What I would try to provoke the people in Burlington to do is to do Ronald Reagan one better. When you start a business, do it democratic. Thank you very much. We'll now do some video.
For the next 10 to 15 minutes, we're going to have a couple of local businessmen to come up and give you a few brief comments concerning their business, or more specifically, why they're looking at employee ownership as a business structure. There's a lot of folks in Burlington, including many in this room, that have had serious discussions recently concerning employee ownership. So I'd like to ask up here Don Schramm from Data Systems, Jerry Atkinson, who's a local business person and also a member of the advisory board, and Will Raap from Gardner Supply to talk about their interest in employee ownership.
Maybe two of you should start. Everybody's heard from me to some extent already.
I'll start. I've had the good fortune in my 23 or 4 years of working full-time to have a job where I've moved around a great deal. I call on and have worked in probably an average of 4, 5, or 6 different businesses. And I'm sorry. I say I've had the good fortune in my working career to work in a wide range of businesses and municipalities, schools, and other places. I have worked in 4 or 5 different places per day for almost my whole working career. And the thing that has become more and more disturbing to me and seemingly almost without solution at times is why it appeared to me that people are becoming more and more apathetic about their jobs, and the companies and employees are just unbelievably inefficient. Some of the places that I call on, which range from very large profitable corporations to very small unprofitable corporations, I don't know how any of them can stay in business the way they operate, to tell you the truth. And I feel the same thing about my own business sometimes. Even though I feel very strongly that I treat my employees almost like members of my family. But I think it's a phenomenon that has reached a head in the United States of America. And I think that the idea of local ownership and employee ownership is a very practical idea that has come of time. I think it's not something that we should look at as that's available just for the odd business or a bunch of carpenters or bricklayers. I think it's something that has come of its time for any type of business. I can't imagine a business that wouldn't benefit from employee ownership. And just think of it practically. I mean, it's the same as perhaps the pride somebody takes in owning their own home, even if the bank has a 99% mortgage on it, versus renting an apartment. That's a subject that hasn't been touched on very much by some of the other speakers, and I think it's something that really drives the point home. I just think it's a wonderful idea that's here, and hopefully that we can nurture and foster in Burlington.
How many of you are familiar with Gardner's Supply Company? So I'm going to be not progressive first, but an entrepreneur first. This is our catalog. I'm going to put them on the table over here. So before you go, if you're interested in your Gardner, I'd like you to pick one up. Gardner Supply Company is a company that has been in business 4 years, essentially. And we've grown 100% per year each of those 4 years. We now have about 25 employees, and we'll be doing about $3 million in business. And what's interesting about that for me is it's not really planned. It's not a process we're going through, watching the steps and very, very much anticipating project to project as we go along. Rather, what we're doing is bringing employees into the organization that are really committed to whatever it is we're doing at that moment. As a company, Gardner Supply Company is currently 75% employee-owned, so we're better than People's Air, we're better than Eastern Airlines. I mean, we're better than a lot of those people on the board, and we want to even be better yet. What that is, we're not sure, because right now we don't really care about structure. What we care about is the way our business works and the way that people fit into that business. So we probably spend 10 or 20% of our time working on what the literature is now calling the culture of the business. That's one of the new buzzwords, the culture of the business. We spend a lot of energy and time working on the culture of our business. And that has to do with, we called it earlier, democratic. We definitely have a democratic culture. I think, as president of Gardner Supply Company, that democratic culture is going to evolve into a democratic structure. I don't know what that's going to look like right now. And really, that's not so much the point, because I think that's going to happen over time. So one thing I really want to take issue with is form is not it, to me. It's approach, it's attitude, it's the amount of responsibility, respect, trust you introduce into the workplace. That is it. I think that democratic ownership can really support that happening. As a company, Gardner Supply Company, I'll go through just a recent experience we had. We're somewhat seasonal in that we are primarily mail order business, although we do some retail sales and some wholesale sales. And we recently got into some trouble in that we had a backlog of orders. A lot of business was coming in. We didn't have the staff in our warehouse to process them. So we started adding people on rather rapidly. And where's the target population in Burlington being in terms of economic development support is lower income single women head of households. So we just hired 5 of them. And it wasn't so much our intention to do that. It was because these women were really willing to work in our warehouse environment and they were coming to the job. They weren't coming to Gardner Supply Company, and we needed bodies at that time. What happened for us is we rapidly went from about 4 people in the warehouse to 12 people in the warehouse. And we have about 15 people full-time in the office space doing marketing and administrative and data processing, that sort of thing. And we created 2 cultures. Without plan, that's what happened. So we had a warehouse culture, which were people who were coming in and working under a certain expectation of what work is about. And we had an office culture which had a different expectation of what work was about. And we didn't spend a lot of energy trying to connect those 2 expectations. But in the process of bringing those people on and just going about getting the work at hand done, we soon discovered a tension that existed, and that tension built and built and built until we realized we had to do something about it. And so what we did is we really stopped everything, set the orders aside for a bit, and said, we have to integrate you into our business and get you to understand what it is we're about so you can really participate fully in our organization. And one of the results of that was one of these people who's been with us a month and a half is now essentially managing the warehouse of 12 people. She was on welfare 2 months ago, and now she's managing a warehouse, doing an incredible job. If I'd seen her resume, I would have never brought her in to do that job. What I think happened is the organization supported her in being successful. And that's, I think, the essence of what democratic ownership or management is for me, is supporting people to be successful so that the organization can be successful. If there's anything else I want to say. Just back to my entrepreneurship role for a minute. I really don't see the difference, entrepreneurship and progressive. I think that's a really wonderful use of terms. And I'm happy to try and to personally be trying to participate in seeing how those two things come together. And there is some tension for me about that, coming from basically a capitalist mentality, now trying to see it structurally somewhat different. But Gardner Supply Company I see as a company that can continue its growth rate of 100% per year under one condition, which is the degree to which we involve employees and attract employees and support employees in really knowing that they matter and knowing that they count in the organization. And I guess in conclusion, I don't want to say, I'm not sure that that's structural. I think that that's environmental. And it might be, and one of the things that I'm doing and Gardner Supply Company is doing is going to be working with ICA to find out if it is also structural. That is, if the form can support what we're trying to do in terms of how we do business. So I really look forward to working with you folks in that process. Thank you.
I want to start off by talking in general terms. I think most of us have been brought up to put our dreams aside as we grow up. We have a dream, but we're taught that we can't do it that way. There are ways things have happened, and we have to do it the way people have done it in the past. In the last few years, we've seen that doesn't have to be the case in Burlington. That we are able to dream about the way our community can be, the way we would like to see it be, and it can actually happen. Now, I think the same thing is true of the workplace. It's my dream that the workplace and my home place don't have to be two distinct environments. They can both be the best places for me to be. They could be happy places, they can be joyful places, they can be very creative places. And the only thing that's holding us back from making that a possibility is ourselves. All we have to do is say, okay, what do we want? And let's start doing it. And this is the way all of us at Data Systems feel. We basically want our workplace to be a place where we have real say over what happens, a place where we feel comfortable, a place where we feel at home, a place where we can play, a place where we can be really creative. And that's the main reason that we're going in the direction that we're going. And part of the feeling that goes along with that is the feeling of fairness, a feeling that really in the workplace we should have a situation where it's labor hiring capital and not the other way around. It's the labor in most businesses that creates the profits. It's not the capital that's in the business. And people's hard labor should get the benefits of that. Now, I think that worker ownership is a good idea for any business. But I can speak best of Data Systems. And it seems to be one hell of a good idea for Data Systems. Data Systems is a digital OEM. We sell the full line of deck equipment as well as IBM PC compatibles. We write a lot of software. We create systems for a lot of businesses in Vermont. It's a very labor-intensive kind of enterprise. We need some capital, but basically what we need is a lot of creative energies of all the people that are involved in the business. The way that we all can give that kind of creative energy is to feel that it's our place, that we really belong there, and that we have some say in what happens and some say in the directions that this business takes. So that's one reason why worker ownership or worker co-op is really a good idea for Data Systems. Another reason it's a good idea is because we can share responsibility. The responsibility is shared among all of us to see that that business really works. And when one of us from Data Systems goes into a customer site, it's not just an employee of Data Systems that's there, it's an owner. And what happens on that customer site in terms of programming, in terms of taking care of their computers, the person that's there doing that is a person responsible for seeing that Data Systems does the best possible job that we can do. Now, along this lines, because we all have a say in the direction that the company can go in, we can attract the most talented people, the people with the most skill. And we really need it in this area. In the area of computer hardware and software, the changes are happening almost on a daily basis. And it's almost impossible for any one person to stay abreast of all that's happening. So we need talented people in every aspect of our business. And we need to listen to everybody in the business, and we need to have everybody in the business feel that their ideas, their skills are going to really make a difference. So all of us basically feel that the company's interest is our interest. Okay, so those are some of the reasons. But still it comes down, the most important reason is that it's a great place to be. And when I go into work at Data Systems, I'm going into a place that I feel really comfortable about, and I feel that I can really do some good work there, I can be really creative, I feel very supported by the people around me, and they feel the same way. Now, I don't want to say that this means that we leave behind us all good traditional business practices. We don't. As Chris pointed out earlier, we still have board of directors, there's to some extent a hierarchical responsibility. When any one of us takes on a project for a business, we have a project manager, and there are people who work under that manager. it may, we may each take a turn at being the project manager, but there is very clearly defined job descriptions, very clearly defined responsibilities for all of us. So, I don't know what else there is to say except that basically the idea of a worker cooperative, worker ownership, is something that's going to make any business, as far as I can see, a much better business. And what you do is you take the strengths of traditional business practices and you add worker ownership on top of that, and you've got something that really works.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's nice to see that there are some folks coming out of the closet who are interested in employee ownership. Before we break into the last segment, I want to point out that at this table over here we have food for the stomach as well as food for the mind. So there's a lot of good resources over there. So the next segment will consume about 20 minutes, and then we'll break from the formal presentation. And then soon after, we'll have this Mondragon film, which is, I think, about a half-hour film. So I'd like to ask those folks who have agreed to serve as resources to come up in the front of the room now. This is going to give you a chance to ask some questions of some professionals in the field. Scudder, I'm not sure that you're aware that we had you down as a resource. But,
Now you are.
I'll briefly introduce these folks, and then we'll open it up for questions. I'd like to introduce Robin Lipman.
In the legislation. But what you're doing here is very important. I hope we'll see some of that same kind of work done at the state level. We need these kind of resources brought to bear when there are plant closings. When we talk about the various strategies for economic development in the state and making this a place that has a good business climate, we want to have employee ownership as one of the things that makes this place truly a good business climate. So we hope that you'll do your work well here, but we hope you'll also be a part of working on these issues and building a network of people who know how to make this instrument work around the state. So it's a real privilege to be over here. Thank you.
Thanks for coming on, Scudder. Make a few other brief introductions, then we'll throw it open for questions. Bill Mayers is also on the advisory board. Bill is a representative from the city of Burlington. He serves on the Commerce Committee and is in a position to influence economic development legislation. He also is a co-author of a book called Working Together, which addresses issues of the worker participation in the workplace. Bruce Seifer is the Economic Development Specialist with the Community and Economic Development Office. He is, at this time, essentially the key staff person for the Burlington Local Ownership Development Project. And Bruce is the guy that you should contact first if you have an interest in either starting an employee-owned business or converting an existing business to employee ownership. Bruce can explain to you what's available for both technical and financial assistance, and hopefully what we can't provide you from the city, we can at least point you in the right direction as a resource. Nancy Wilson is a business analyst with the Industrial Cooperative Association. Right now in the city of Burlington, we're working with about 6 individual businesses that are interested in either starting up or converting to employee ownership. And Nancy, through a contract with the city as well as through contracts with individual businesses, is assisting us in those transitional phases. You've met Chris Mackin, who is a policy director. We also have with us Steve Dawson. Steve, maybe you could just point yourself out. Steve's the executive director of the Industrial Cooperative Association. So for the next 10 minutes, we're just going to open it up for any questions that you might have, and I'll try to direct the questions to the person who might have the answers. Any questions or comments? Chris?
I think the question is, this is going to someone who's gone through the process, and philosophically, it makes an awful lot of sense. I think for part of everyone who started business, there's a bit of a belief there that you work dedicated all your weekends and put in 120 hours how does that look at? Does the compensation for the owner who's really had the given up paychecks and started something like that?
Nancy?
Well, I'll stand up. As far as, it's definitely a key issue that we work on in the transition, and a dicey one to work with. The question was, what about the entrepreneur who starts the company? How do you go about compensating that person for all the time, sweat, energy, everything else that they put into the business? And what I was saying is that it's a sensitive topic, because it'd be one thing if someone could easily evaluate and attach a number to that and say that in dividing up the ownership, you were going to be compensated by a certain dollar amount, and that's all it stood for, or that it was that easily packaged. But in my experience, it's never that easy, and I guess I would never want it to be that easy, that you would be able to value it so cleanly. And I think what happens is that it's a process that you go through. It's not a cookie-cutter approach that says, okay, then on day 10, we'll transfer the ownership and you give it up and boom, it becomes employee-owned and everything changes instantaneously. But that it's definitely a process that's sort of a group process. What you've created is not only a business but a social organization, and bringing all those people together and sort of working it out. It's a negotiation, a developmental stage, process, whatever you want to call it, that will include attaching some kind of numbers to the ownership, what kind of dollar compensation, that will include some gradual transition perhaps in ownership, in who controls the board of directors and how the board gets elected, and in the designations of what are the managerial responsibilities that stay with the owner-founder and which pieces get shared with other people who come on board. I think mostly we find in the work that we do that there's not one approach that says, here's how you do it, and it worked here, and so therefore it's going to work there. It's very much working with the people involved to develop a structure that meets their needs, their perspectives, and so on. I'll also say that there have been some projects that we've worked on where that issue of compensating the founder has meant that projects haven't gone forward or have run into a whole lot of trouble, particularly of a retiring owner who has been working on it for an awful long time. You know, it's their whole life they've put into it, and trying to the postpartum, trying to define a way to let go is just a really difficult issue. And I'm not going to say that there's an easy way to it, but I think we feel that by developing some kind of group process where people will come together and work through those issues and really pin down what is it that's a financial piece, what is it that's control over which issues, and really defining what those are and where the decision points are, that you can structure something that can work over time and meet those needs. So that's sort of a long-winded, there's no easy answer approach.
Thank you. Bun, you have a quick...
I think the funny forum says that the future belongs to those who learn how to do more with less. And somebody said earlier, we talked about the low that stresses the plant. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about the labor intensive is done, Schramm was talking about the computer and software business compared to, say, the capital intensive business like plants going out in Springfield. Which is kind of knows a lot about that.
I could speak to that briefly. You'll see, if you have time to stick around for the Mondragon film, and we can maybe schedule another time for people since it is getting late, that capital-intensive industries can go worker-owned as well as labor-intensive industries. The steel plant, the Weirton steel plant you saw on the film, is obviously a very capital-intensive industry. That is now employee-owned. The Seymour Specialty Wire plant in New Haven, Connecticut, outside of New Haven, is also capital-intensive. Your question, if I get the drift, is a good one, though, to emphasize that in some senses the obstacles to moving in this direction are less if you have a high-skill, labor-intensive kind of a business. The financing problems are not as significant. You still need to get financing. We still need to have some assets to secure the loans and so forth. We're not going to get it. Those problems don't go away. But the startup obstacles to getting a business going are less, generally speaking, with labor-intensive industries than with capital-intensive industries. But I wouldn't say for a minute that one is exclusive of the other. It's a question of just the strategy and how much time it takes to put the deal together.
What do you think happened with Lowell's briefly?
Very briefly, that was, I believe, 1977. The Vermont Asbestos Group was sold to its employees by GAF, I believe, was the conglomerate corporation. That was in this era, this modern era, which I think actually Vermont Asbestos in some sense was one of the very first companies, and this happened a lot back in the late 19th century, but this was one of the first companies of this era to go in this direction. There were a lot of very ill-informed people, particularly the workers. The workers were told almost overnight what was going to happen and what their rights were and what their rights weren't. And it was a very top-down, management-controlled kind of a process. And the company did amazingly well for a phase here, and actually Bill maybe could speak to this because I think he wrote about it in his book. The company did amazingly well for a time, in part because the asbestos market went up, and in part because of productivity associated with employee ownership. But because of the poor structure that was used in that case, and because of a lack of education and information and trust that the employees didn't have about what was going on, when push came to shove, when it came to a tight situation, the workers basically said, well, look, we don't have control over this place. We don't really own it. You know, we're nervous about this. We're not quite sure what's going to happen here. And when the first good proposition came down the road to take the ownership off their hands, because they couldn't trust in the future, they sold out. And that was a part of problem of structure and part of problem of education. Those problems are going to continue to happen. But that, I believe, is the story in the Vermont asbestos case. Bill, do you want to speak to that?
A couple hours. No, I'll just add a couple points to that. One fact you did mention is just normal human greed. Their original shares they bought for $50 and they were sold for $2,000, and it went that high in 2.5 years. And so there was a desire of any normal human being, capitalist or otherwise, to recoup on your investment. When there's that, there's also the question of education, just not being prepared for the requirements of participatory working, and there was no model. They had no instruction within the company. They had no other example to look at, and there was also a factor of just how the ownership shares were divided. I mean, one guy had 100 shares that became worth $200,000, and then other people had maybe 5 shares or 2 shares. So there's a real spread of economic interest in the success of the company. And I think that it was, and then there's one other factor that where they did have employees, and I think it's a little misleading to say worker-owned. I mean, I've always been a little bit nervous about saying companies are worker-owned. It's a little bit better to say employee-owned, because a lot of companies have managers and workers own the firms. And I think when you say worker-owned, it automatically puts a class overtone on it that isn't always justified. But in the case of Vermont Asbestos, you had union representatives under the old system who became board members. So the guy would get up in the morning and he'd say, what hat am I wearing? Am I an employee? Am I a union member? Am I a union steward? Am I a board member? Am I an owner? Well, the fact was he was all 5. But again, it was a question, how do you train somebody to wear 5 of those hats? Only Bartholomew can wear 5 hats. So anyway.
We figured all that out, so next question.
And we'll take a couple more questions. Sure, Tom.
While Reagan is saying go out and start a business, it seems like he's undermining a lot of the opportunities to doing small business administration, whatever. I'm wondering what individuals' experience has been as far as other municipal models or state models as far as providing that venture capital. For instance, with the Vermont Industrial Development Corporation, like setting aside 20% of the money supporting employee-owned businesses. Are there any other models nationally involved?
Well, in the city of Burlington, we have a Burlington revolving loan program, which is designed to offer gap financing for small businesses. There's been about $400,000 committed to that program. It's a limited resource. ICA has a $1 million revolving loan fund, which is specifically available for employee-owned businesses. The state of Vermont has a couple of programs. One's the Vermont Job Start program, and there also is pending legislation for the creation of a state venture capital fund, which will be considered by the legislature again next session, which, in my opinion, the current legislation has some problems, but I think that there is a emerging commitment to provide venture startup capital. Bill or Scudder, do you want to speak to what the state's doing?
What the state should do?
Well, wait. Talking about like an affirmative action program for employee-owned businesses, not just.
Well, if I can just quickly say, there are a couple of states that have done that. Pennsylvania is one state that has created special funds for employee ownership. We're talking to some legislators in Massachusetts about doing the same. There are some precedents. Some states have done it. I think you've got two very sympathetic legislators sitting in front here who I suspect are eager to take up the task, but let them speak for themselves.
Well, I think my response is that I think that should be a very high priority in the state's economic development strategy. And I think now that we have the legislation in place that clarifies the status of worker cooperative or worker employee ownership business, that should be a high priority. I think the Job Start program is one that we have already talked about targeting as an area in which it might work well with employee ownership. And I'm eager to work with, I don't regard myself as a genius in devising these systems, have been doing some homework on what other states have done, and I'm eager to work with folks in this area and from around the state as to what would be helpful for startup funds. All corporations which are employee ownership owned would be eligible immediately for, just as any other is, for the VEDA and various other programs that are out there. So that's already in place, and I think we will work with VEDA and other groups to encourage the assisting in a special way of employee-owned businesses. That certainly would be one of my objectives.
I'd like to add a comment to that from the business analyst perspective, and Robin might be thinking the same thing, I have a feeling, but and that is that I'm all for, clearly all the work that I do relates to employee ownership, and I'm very interested in sources of financing that can be made available to worker-owned companies. One of the things that's happened in the last couple of years is the development of a venture capital firm company based in Colorado that specializes in venture capital financing for employee-owned companies. Now, to most venture capitalists' way of thinking, that's a real contradiction in terms, and that if the ownership is going to be in the employees, then what's the interest of a venture capitalist in the company? Nevertheless, they've worked out some ways to invest either in companies where there's going to be a transition to employee ownership, or where early on it is all sort of owned and controlled by the employees, and that venture capitalist has some special rights in the early stages, but over time will get their money out and be able to go on to the next deal, and the company basically stays or starts out employee-owned. So that there's that venture capital there. But the point that I want to make is that while I'm all in favor of these sort of special funds that are designated for employee-owned companies, I'm also very much in favor of making sure that the reason those employee-owned companies get that money is because they're solid businesses. The last thing I want to see is a bunch of companies get started because there are special funds made available for employee-owned companies, and the funds get kind of too eager to get the money out there, and so they lend to companies that aren't strong, that don't have well-developed business ideas and business planning, and so they fall on their face. And then in 5 years, someone will say to me, so tell me about all the employee-owned companies, and I'll have this trail of ones that have collapsed because they weren't solid businesses, or they didn't do the kind of business planning and thinking that a business needs to be successful. Sort of being employee-owned isn't enough. So I want to say that I'm very excited about sources of funding that have a special interest in understanding employee-owned companies, in providing technical assistance to them so that they can get the kind of business development support that they need. But in the final analysis, as it were, I want to make sure that they are strong businesses that merit getting funding for the strength of their business, as well as because they're employee-owned.
I'll take one more question, and then we'll formally break. Yes?
If I were to go up to my bosses tomorrow and suggest to them that we begin an open forum on taking this company and putting it into a worker-owned environment, I expect that they'd probably think that they weren't going to get their vacation in Bermuda next year, or for some reason that their financial future was going to be foreshortened. I was wondering if somebody could address the kinds of resistance and financial conflict that owners of businesses have presented and how to break through to the other side.
Well, I think, you know, we're obviously living in a society formed by the structures that we grew up in, and there are going to be people who are not ready for this, and we want no part of it. And we wouldn't be silly to try to give you any other impression. I mean, I would think that if this is an idea, sounds a little bit too simple, but if this is an idea that's of interest to you, you ought to try to bring it up to the boss and say, let's talk this over. And if he doesn't budge, then you and your friends should think of possibly going elsewhere and doing it yourself. The other point of your question, I think, though, is just a question of how education about this idea can get around. So how managers and people in those situations can begin to think about giving up control in some sense. And your point is a good one. There's less exorbitant, self-aggrandizing management behavior in an employee-owned company because the manager knows that the people are looking. You know, and if he's going to go spend the money, you know, on unnecessary trips and so forth, that's not going to wash. So to you managers in the audience who do that kind of stuff, and I'm sure none of them are here, this is the wrong idea for you. But this doesn't mean that workers don't give managers the salary that they need, a competitive salary to keep them in the company, and give them sufficient discretion and authority to be able to do their jobs. They'd be crazy to do it otherwise. Because if you lose your manager who knows how to run your company, you don't have a job. There's no future to it.
Bruce, you had one comment you wanted to make?
Yeah, just a couple of points. One, housekeeping, and two other points. A copy of the legislation that Scudder Parker talked about is on the table over there, so if people want to look at that and take it home with them, it's possible. The other thing is we organized a course that we're running through the Church Street Center on sharing ownership in small business. It was run once in the spring through the Church Street Center. 15 people, business owners, signed up for the course. Actually 18, 15 showed up. And we're working with a few of those business people right now. So we will be able to go into this in more depth and answer some more of the questions that people might have at that point. The other point is, if you want to find out about that, please sign the registration list if you haven't done already, so we can send you out a piece of information on that later.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
So we're gonna take the formal break now. Feel free to approach any of us with informal questions. In about 10 minutes from now, if anybody's interested, we'll start the Mondragon film.
Thank you for coming.